This is Asian Insider and I'm Nirmal Ghosh. Now, the situation in Myanmar has tragically deteriorated. The military junta has been trying to quell countrywide protests and the death toll is unfortunately mounting. There has been a lot of violence, a lot of brutality against the protesters. There is no sign of the regime budging either, but it also faces a resistance that does not look like dying down, powered very much by a younger generation. Now, in the international community, in ASEAN as well as in the West, there is uncertainty as to what to do. Joining me today to discuss this and what may possibly lie ahead are Moe Thuzar, coordinator of the Myanmar Studies program at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and Romain Caillaud, based in Tokyo, principal of the advisory firm SIPA Partners, and an associate fellow also at the Myanmar Studies program at the ICES in Singapore. And from Yangon, Soe Myint Aung, founder of the Yangon Center for Independent Research. Now, Moe Thuzar, may I start with you? Every day we are seeing an escalation, and we are seeing a lot of it in graphic detail and almost immediately online, and this has horrified many observers. Yet the international community, ASEAN, the West, in the US included, does not have very great leverage in Myanmar. I see the pro-democracy protesters are appealing for international intervention, citing, among other things, the right to protect principle of the UN. But as of now, we have only targeted sanctions, which are also unlikely to have much effect. What can the international community realistically do to change the course of the situation in Myanmar?
Thank you, Nirmal. Greetings to everyone from Singapore, where I'm sitting. I'd like to start off with my heartfelt and deepest condolences to the families of all of those who have lost their lives, innocent lives, senselessly in this brutal suppression of peaceful demonstrations, of people who are trying to voice their desire for a return to the democratic transition that had brought so many opportunities and freedoms to society at large. And so on that sad note, I'd like to refer back to what you had talked about, Nirmal, about the mounting casualties. I think the death toll in total since the shooting started around the week of February 9th are now closer to 50. And yesterday was the largest number and most indiscriminate of the suppression across the nation. And so all our hearts are heavy. But what we are seeing now, I think, thanks to the immediacy of information that can spread across the world, we are seeing this almost in real time as it happens. And this is the big difference from 2007, when the internet revolution and sending images out of Myanmar was not that easy, although it did highlight a point in the ability of Myanmar netizens to bypass interceptive software to get those images out. And of course, this is also a far cry from the bloody coup in 1988, where the world could start seeing images only days later. So I think the immediacy of information here is something that we can look at in terms of getting this very serious message across on the kind of impact that it is having in Myanmar and the commitment of the people. Every day they are coming out. Today it is going to be the same. And this is really something that is uniting people across the nation to reject unlawful military rule and also to voice that they want to continue with the democratic transition, imperfect though it may be, but with that wider space for voicing concerns under the government that they had elected in November 2020. And it also highlights the impact and importance of the civil disobedience movement that is continuing in Myanmar, where civil servants, particularly those who are actually doing the work, the pen pushers, the paper pushers, and those who are trying to get the bureaucracy continually running, those are the people who are participating more and more in the civil disobedience movement, which is going on in tandem with the protests. And of course, the protests are also to encourage the CDM, the civil disobedience movement participants. So where does all this, the situation in Myanmar link to what ASEAN and the international community can do? Now, I think there's been a lot of focus on ASEAN and the limitations of regional cooperation in recent days. I think people in Myanmar have always looked to the international community and later as an ASEAN member also to ASEAN for the kind of enhanced interactions or interventions that they could do. And of course the expectations continue, even though I think there is some now disillusionment with maybe the pace at which interventions can happen. So I think this is where I'm trying to look at the kind of creative solutions, the innovative solutions beyond the established practices that ASEAN and the international community have had recourse to. Early on, I recall that there were a group of friends around personages like the United Nations Secretary General. And I think that kind of mechanism, that consultative mechanism of countries that have concern, have interest, have a stake in Myanmar and her future, I think we can certainly regroup and advise key personages such as the United Nations Secretary General, who also has a special rapporteur dealing with this issue, and also at the ASEAN level. I think we can also think about that kind of a friends of the ASEAN Secretary General to really work together cohesively in this kind of a mechanism, which will be very important when we are trying to break through the very stubborn barriers that have been put up, erected by the SAC, who seems to be digging in for the long run, prepared for isolation and sanctions even, to get that message through, because I think mediation is imperative. Bringing the important stakeholders to the negotiation table with dedicated mediators. And it's not about the mediators, yeah? It should never be about the mediators. It is about the mediation and the interests of the key stakeholders, particularly the will of the people. So I know it's difficult, I know it's challenging, but every step towards getting a breakthrough starts with mediation. Even the responsibility to protect, the first step starts with looking at where capacities can be built or shored up before the other intervention steps are escalated. And this is important in a country such as Myanmar, which does not have those firm institutions for democracy yet entrenched. We have weak state capacity. We have a divided society where polarizations can either cause those divisions to go deeper or through mediation and discussing, bringing people to the table, we can maybe try to minimize the very strong feelings of radicalization that are in the breasts of many who, of course, are seeing their numbers repressed and suppressed in a brutal manner day by day as the protests continue. I'm sorry if I've taken too much time, but this is a topic that is very close to my heart, and I'm passionate about what is happening for change in my country.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And Soe Myint Aung, you have said that this has become a zero-sum game, and what is needed is an off-ramp for the military and the NLD to get to a negotiating table. But the military does not seem to be in any mood to negotiate. Do you think it would, perhaps if it is confident that it has the situation under control and not doing so under pressure?
What we can notice here is that both the demonstrators and the security forces had shown a lot of restraint for about three weeks, and then the violent crackdown took place only like 5 or 7 days ago, when the regime's security was, when the regime felt its security was threatened and its legitimacy challenged. The present crisis cannot be overcome by each side pulling to the rather extreme position, making it a zero-sum game. So at the end of the day, negotiation is the only way out. And and we should avoid also raising high expectation on the part of the demonstrators as regards the international institutions and R2P type foreign intervention in Myanmar. We need to come into terms with this post-coup reality. In many ways, the SAC is the de facto regime which holds the center, but they cannot effectively govern the local and ward level, administration. At the same time, they are not significantly lacking in de jure perspectives because their seat is located in Naypyidaw, and which is far away from Yangon and other cities. And the bureaucracy, especially the top level, they can keep running for a while. So we should focus here on the ASEAN centrality, because ASEAN plays an important role in mediating between the military regime and the pro-democracy forces led by Aung San Suu Kyi. So we should not leave some channel of communications. We should not close all channels of communication with the regime, and we should take a longer perspective. And for example, we should even think about reactivating some mechanism like the ASEAN Special Envoy to Myanmar. So it will not only facilitate ASEAN's access to the generals in Naypyidaw, but it can also serve as an intermediary for the domestic intermediaries, because this is a very tense situation inside the country, and any attempt to mediate between the military authorities and the pro-democracy populations are easily, very quickly undermined or discredited, because the people are so furious that their democratically elected government had been removed and taken away by the military. So I think the role of the international community here is not to exacerbate the existing tensions, but to mediate and diffuse the conflict, so that any channel of communication will be open. And ASEAN also should maintain its centrality.
Okay, Romain, over to you in Tokyo. I wanted to ask you, what are the ramifications on the economic front? Now, we know that Myanmar was already struggling. It had the pandemic to deal with as well before this, and now it risks falling deeper into a hole. What do you anticipate economically?
Yes, thank you, Nirmal. And my condolences also to the people of Myanmar, given current events. Clearly, there is an economic disaster in the making. It has already started, not only because of the protests, but most importantly, because of the civil disobedience movement. Most banks are not operating fully. Ports are not operating fully. Border crossings with neighbors are closed in many circumstances because customs officers have walked away from their posts. Same holds true for many hospitals, schools. So Myint was mentioning the fact that the government, the military regime cannot control local ward and village offices, meaning that local administration is not functioning. So basically, you have a situation that has been lasting for about a month, and that is worsening daily, where the economy has stopped. You can imagine in a country like Myanmar that is highly dependent on a few sectors, such as garment export, or for example, agriculture. In the first case, strikes, and of course the end of orders by international brands that are extremely concerned about the situation on the ground. On the other hand, agriculture, financing for farmers who are usually heavily indebted, not working properly, and goods not being able to be exported as per usual. I mean, again, we are looking at a month of an economic disaster in the making, with an impact that is only going to increase as we move forward. And I think the impact will increase for a number of reasons. The first week after the coup, what I could see among the business community, especially, and others, was the idea that this was a regime that we could work with. For example, the fact that Aung Nainu had been appointed minister, someone who was well known to investors under former President Thein Sein and the NLD government. So there were these signals of a certain level of continuity, and SAC saying that it will remain business friendly and nothing will change. And so I think it worked for a week until the protests and civil disobedience movement took fire and started, and that the spiral of violence started to escalate. I think all this, the idea that this regime can be a normal business partner has gone out of the window for many country governments and investors and aid agency and others who are playing a role in the Myanmar economy in one way or another. So again, I'm very pessimistic about the state of the Myanmar economy moving forward, not only short term, but mid-term. I think that the shocks, the political shock, the social shock, and the upcoming sanction strengthening that is coming, and the huge political and reputation risks associated with any type of business activity in the country, and seeing all of these shocks will add up and lead to an economic disaster for Myanmar.
Soe Myint Aung, if I may go back to you in Yangon, the young demonstrators, it is a leaderless movement, or as one of them told me, everyone is a leader. This is both an advantage as there are no leaders to arrest, but it is also a problem because there is no unified message. And the military is a very large institution. It has all the power. What is your view on this dynamic going forward? What is your forecast for these protests? What are you sensing on the ground over there?
Well, the demonstrators are leaderless and directionless. Initially, the Generation Z is said to be leading the movement. But later on, there has been more politically oriented organization like the committee representing the Bidangzu parliament. But the problem is that the protesters are now increasingly striving for something that can easily be achieved, which means removing the military authoritarian system once and for all. And they have to be specific about the objectives they would like to achieve, like the release of the detained leaders, particularly Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and the recognition of the 2020 election results in some way. The military, on the other hand, is one of the most institutionalized state organ that holds the multi-ethnic country together. And up until this point, they are able to keep running bureaucracy in Naypyidaw, issuing one law after another, controlling also the top level of civil servants. So the question is that, if we would like to see if we'd like to see the same kind of history repeating itself, like if we would like to see another 10 or 20 years of a political stalemate in this country if this idealistic ambition of removing military dictatorship can be obtained. That's the reason why we should keep looking for any opportunities for negotiated compromise to happen, and we should also need this regional support from ASEAN, and so that the protesters and the populations will have access and to the detained leaders, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and also start making very concrete and realizable goals. And also another thing is that we should not be going into this vicious circle, because the more the regimes is not recognized, and the more they felt threatened and vulnerable, and they would go into this brutal and horrific crackdown on the civilian populations. But after the crackdown, they feel threatened and weakened again, and this restarts the cycle of violence on both sides without any external help. Like if we have a quarrel in a household, there should be people who come in and mediate between the two sides. So exacerbating the quarrel by encouraging one side or another is not a solution. So I understand that many people in Myanmar these days see this as a struggle between the good and evil, but we still should keep some gray areas open. We should have some space so that this national reconciliation and peacemaking can be possible. Because also at the end of the day, so we have a longest civil war in the country, and this civil conflict between a number of ethnic armed organizations and the central government can only be solved with the full participation of the national armed forces. So when we try to solve the situation in the short term, we should also consider the consequences and the implications that would have for the country's peace process and national reconciliation.
Moe Thuzar, we are almost out of time, but I'll give you the last word, if I may, 30 seconds to 1 minute. Do you concur with all of that? Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, Soe Myint Aung makes important points, and I'm glad to note that he also picked up on what I talked about, mediation being imperative. Mediation is important because there are these gray areas that Soe Myint Aung highlighted. It is just that I think for the current moment of struggle, it becomes more between forces of good and evil, black and white. But Myanmar has always been in shades of gray because of the historical legacies that we've been talking about. So when mediation happens, there needs to be creative ways, looking back at what has worked or not worked in the past. Soe Myint Aung mentioned an ASEAN special envoy. I maintain that it should also be with other mechanisms such as involving the past, present, and incoming chairs of ASEAN, because it's going to be a long-term proposition. It's not something that neither the international community nor the regional organization or even people in Myanmar can deal with and move on. It's not an instant gratification moment. If it is anything, the reality that has led to this point has been decades in the making, compounded by very intransigent attitudes. And I think it will need that long-term kind of consultations, negotiations, and the goodwill and support of the international community working together with who can actually bring about change, and also building capacities for change with the organizations and entities that are currently supporting what is important. And of course, looking at how we can establish those rules that, that entrench civilian rule. But this is all a long-term proposition, and Myanmar, I think, needs long-term commitment, support, and understanding.
Moe Thuzar, Romain Caillaud, and Soe Myint Aung in Yangon, thank you very much for your time today. The Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, is the same Tatmadaw that was in power only a little over 10 years ago. But it is not the same country it was 10 years ago. It is not the same world as it was in the 80s or even the 90s. There is more visibility. There is less tolerance for atrocities against civilians. Tragically, though, this situation could well get more nasty before it gets better. For Asian Insider, I'm Nirmal Ghosh.